Alright guys, so let's talk about a very important development. It's a sign that US tariffs are starting to tear itself apart. Now it has always been US foreign policy to remain the world's sole hegemon, and that means keeping Germany down and to prevent China and Russia from getting together. Well, those plans have backfired. China and Russia are closer than ever before, and Germany is also starting to stand on its own by casting aside their silly fiscal rules. And now we have another seismic event happening. The United States is beginning to push China and Japan together. Now, after the recent meeting between China, Japan, and South Korea, these giant Asian economies have decided to work together. They will be jointly responding to US tariffs. Now, we have no idea what was the final agreement. This event should be still very disconcerting to Trump. Now, this mirrors the events of the last 3 years where Biden pushed Putin towards China and created this no limits partnership. This is what happens when you decide to hit the world with tariffs. Japan and Korea are particularly exposed to Trump's trade war. Who are the biggest victims of his steel, auto, and semiconductor tariffs? They are Japan and Korea. The US has really gone off the rails this time. In order to reshore production, especially of all these high tech industries, Trump has decided to punish his allies in addition to US adversaries. In response, they are banding together with China to improve bilateral trade, and this includes strengthening their economies together to cooperate trilaterally to effectively address emerging challenges, which obviously refers to Trump's trade tariffs. Now, the only way to push back against the US is to build economic ties with another major power, and the only country that's big enough, that's secure enough, is China. This is very important when you face big trade barriers exporting your goods to the US. Trump's tariffs of 25% and the upcoming reciprocal punishments are incredibly punitive. Just take what South Korea is going to face from these reciprocal tariffs. There's a big trade gap between the country and the United States. US exports to South Korea face over 13% in import tariffs, which makes US goods more expensive, while South Korean products sent to the US faces less than 2% tariffs, so there is a big disparity here. If Trump decides to maximize his reciprocal tariffs, South Korean goods exported to the US consumer will face a big trade barrier. And obviously, the Koreans as well as the Japanese are not prepared for this. The US has been their traditional ally. None of them ever expected the Americans to do a 180 and weaponize the entire trade policy. Now, we get a very common pushback on US reciprocal tariffs, and there are two ways to look at it. Now, the US perspective is simple. The world is raising trade barriers to our goods, and we have the right to counter punish them and raise our own. It's basically the Scott Besson argument.
The nature of reciprocal tariffs is that if we start matching, whether it's the EU, that any other country in the world with reciprocal tariffs, we're just doing what they're doing and then adding in these other factors. If they remediate those, which is path dependent on their reaction function, if they do that, then their tariffs could drop. If they want to be recalcitrant, if they want to continue these unfair trade practices, then the tariff wall will go up until they are willing to negotiate.
Now, on the surface level, this sounds reasonable, doesn't it? If Japan or Korea drops their tariffs, the US will remove theirs. But let's look at the perspective of the global economy, especially US allies. Many countries, especially Japan and Korea, all believe they have a right to put tariffs on US goods. Why? Because they are already paying tribute to the US in many other ways. In response to Trump's auto tariff, Japan's Prime Minister pushed back. We invest in the US, we provide employment, and we pay the highest wages. We are the largest investor in the United States. And over the past decades, G7 allies they have been giving Trump's economy enormous benefits that can't be discounted. And this includes investing into the US economy by building new plants and factories. Scott Besson looking at the trade tariffs is a very narrow interpretation of the entire economic landscape. He is cherry-picking data points to suit Trump's narrative. But here's the other part of the story they aren't telling you. Japan is the single biggest investor country in the United States. In 2023, total investment reached an incredible $783 billion, and that's easily 15 times more than what China has invested into the US. Now, the top investors are all G7 allies. Canada piled in more than $750 billion, while Germany and the UK are third and fourth. They invested over $600 billion in total each over the last few decades. Now, sure, the US consumer market is the biggest in the world, but don't forget what these investment dollars bring. They bring with them critical expertise, technology transfers, and more importantly, the creation of jobs, all in exchange for paper dollars. And this is a big reason why the US was still able to maintain certain industries despite all the wasteful government spending. Listening to the Trump administration, they've been complaining that foreign countries are hollowing out US manufacturing. But is that really the case? US manufacturing employment is supported by huge sums of foreign investments. Japan once again tops the list. In 2022, they provided nearly a million Americans with jobs in Japanese companies, more than half of which comes from the manufacturing sector. Looking at things holistically, the world is paying tribute to the US economy. Peasant wants tariffs, but that would mean having your cake and eating it too. Let's not forget the amount of treasuries US allies and the world at large is holding. The world is supporting Trump's economy by continuing to buy American bonds, and that is helping to support US government spending and keeping a lid on yields just waiting to explode. The deficit this year is expected to hit 6.5% of GDP. Now, what happens if foreign countries stop buying? Foreign investors are helping to prevent the sky from falling down. They account for nearly a quarter of total US public debt held. That's more than the Federal Reserve and other US agencies plus Social Security put together. Remember what these countries are getting back in return: a yield that hardly outpaces inflation in the real world. I don't really care about nominal yields. And every time the US decides to print money through quantitative easing, QE, the real value of their bond holdings collapses. Now, sure, they get back the nominal value, but the purchasing power still plunges. Japan is one of the most loyal holders of US debt, hitting over 1.2 trillion in 2014. Even though Japan has a currency crisis today, they still hold over $1 trillion in treasury bonds. And unlike China, they aren't dumping everything just yet. Other US allies like Canada and the UK are also subsidizing the US economy through the bond market. Looking at just the tariffs are a very myopic way to judge what is fair or not. Trump and Besson are trying to push their own narrative. When Trump threatened steel and auto tariffs to the Japanese and the Koreans, that was the last straw. They rely heavily on their car exports to the US to drive growth. Now, in Japan, the auto sector accounts for 3% of the entire country's GDP and 15% of the entire manufacturing economy. And that's how significant it is to Tokyo. South Korea and Japan both have significant exposures to the US consumer market. And this goes beyond just consumer products like cars. They export a ton of intermediate and capital goods to the US, including semiconductors. Now, Japan, for example, sends 21% of their capital goods and 16% of intermediate products to the US market. For South Korea, it's around 15% for both. Their exposure is much less than Canada or Mexico, but it's still very significant, especially for the Japanese. Their economy is on the brink of a recession, and inflation is actually higher there than the US and Europe. Trump wants to impose semiconductor tariffs on the world. He also wants to reshore chip production from TSMC in Taiwan all the way to the US. So Korean and Japanese chip makers, they are in panic mode. Now, first, they couldn't sell their chips and equipment to China, and now they can't even sell to the United States in the future. It's no surprise that Japan and South Korea, they are doing a strategic pivot.
On tariffs, are you concerned that the countries that would be most affected, like India, would just shift their trading to China?
No, I'm not concerned about anything, really.
But I think Trump better be concerned because China is a huge economy that's only going to grow bigger down the road. Now, if you're Japan or any other US ally looking to diversify, you want a country that's big enough and yet not reliant on the US. And that crosses out most of the world, including Europe. That's gone. But Beijing's economy checks all the boxes you need. China is the only country that's an economic superpower and not dependent on US trade for their economic growth. US exports accounts for less than 2% of China's GDP growth, and last year China grew at 5%. This means even if Trump bans the import of all Chinese goods tomorrow, their economy will still grow. It will be the US consumer that will suffer from higher inflation and face all the consequences. And this gives China the ability to act independently without the need to follow US orders. This is how crazy Trump's trade war has become. The US already made a strategic mistake linking Russia and China together. This gave Beijing a treasure trove of cheap commodities, and by pushing Japan and South Korea towards China, Trump is following Biden's playbook of helping Beijing. It won't be commodities this time, but in technology, especially chips. We could see Beijing, Korea, and Japan work out a grand bargain to benefit each other to secure their economies from US tariffs. South Korea's chip industry is one great example. South Korea controls two-thirds of the global memory chip market. This is done, of course, through Samsung Electronics and SK Hynix, giant companies that have a commanding presence in this very lucrative semiconductor market. And just like Japan and the Netherlands, there's a big stumbling block. Their biggest enemy towards greater revenues is none other than the United States. Korea is facing the same problem as Japan. The US doesn't want them to export to China, which is the biggest consumer of chips in the world. But at the same time, Trump wants to reshore semiconductor production back to the US, stealing their lunch at the same time. Since the start of the year, Korea's chip exports to China have been collapsing thanks to the restrictions. Sales to Beijing fell by 22% in January and 32% last month compared to the year before. How is this fair? The US is punishing the Korean economy and by extension their GDP growth to accomplish US geopolitical objectives. The fact they are banding together with Japan to get closer to China really says a lot. Countries around the world they are tired of the US using them as pawns. Following Biden to sanction Russia is one thing, but deindustrializing your own economies for Trump is simply crossing the line now. China could always go to Japan and Korea with a grand bargain to buy their chips, to soak up all their supply and give them even minimum quotas to ensure sales. Now, this can be done for the car industry as well. They can always work something out because Japan and Korea, they need to move their exports somewhere else. The 25% auto tariffs are very brutal. Combined, South Korea and Japan sells over 3 million cars to the United States annually. And for Korea, that's 50% of the entire automobile exports. US tariffs are going to do a number on the auto industry. Either exports will outright fall or factories will relocate to the US and deindustrialize Japan and Korea. We are seeing them wake up to the fact that Trump is serious about bringing home manufacturing. And over the next 4 years, the auto tariffs are not going to go away, they're going to stay.
Conditions under which you'd remove these auto tariffs, sir, or is this permanent for the rest of your term in office?
Oh, this is permanent, yeah, 100%, yeah.
So we could see China come up with a big bargain, some grand plan that encompasses everything. Keep selling chips to us and we'll buy more of your cars. In fact, let's cut away all our trading barriers and streamline our supply chains. Now, Trump has managed to do the impossible. He has managed to push China closer to Japan and Korea, countries with very complex disagreements and historical issues with Beijing. However, all unified in their hatred towards US tariffs, we can expect more US allies to do the same thing as well down the road. But let me know what you think. Which countries will be next to work with China? Will it be Europe or even Canada? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe. Be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.